This is the 2021 California Association of Realtors California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions, which is going to be released on December 20, 2021. At least that is the expected date. Today, I want to do a full in-depth review of this particular form. It used to be less than 10 pages. Then it became 10, 14, and now it is 16 pages. It's getting longer and longer each year. Oh man, every time when they had a new revision, and the last revision was 2018. I'm sure there's been a lot of changes in California law. Certainly there is some improvement that can be made to the form. Let's start with the first page, page number 1. On the top left, you put down the date prepared, and 1A, fill in the name of the buyer. B, put in the address. Note that under the address, there's a little note that says postal mailing address may be different from city jurisdiction. Buyer is advised to investigate. This refers to a situation where the city name especially could be different in some cases from the official record. So for example, in Jurupa Valley, in some area, it might be known as Riverside. So it's important to make a note of that. Number 2 is the agency disclosure. This particular paragraph talks about acknowledgement of receipt of the disclosure. By signing the purchase agreement, both the buyer and the seller acknowledge they have each received disclosure of agency relationship from their respective agents. A new way of doing things. A buyer's agent is not required to give the seller's agent the AD form signed by the buyer. Likewise, a seller's agent is not legally obligated to give the buyer's agent the AD form signed by the seller. 2B confirmation, you got the broker part and the agent part for both sides, the seller and the buyer. And if it's and then you go ahead and put in the name of the brokerage firm, license number on the right hand side, and then check whether the broker represents the seller only or both the seller and the buyer. Agent, you do the same thing, put in the name of the agent, and then on the right hand side, the agent's license number. Indicate whether the seller's agent, the salesperson, is only representing the seller or representing both the buyer and the seller. Next is the buyer's brokerage firm. You basically repeat the whole process, other than this time you're filling in for the buyer's side, brokerage, and agent. The most significant improvement in the RPA, I would say, is paragraph 3 or section 3. But before we talk about section 3, there's 2D here we need to talk about. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller is actually a form that is included in that one package for the RPA. That's why it's automatically checked. In section 3, if you want to figure out the most important dates, dollar amount, and time, you will come to this particular box. There are basically 4 columns in this box. First one is the paragraph number for the particular term or condition. Second one is the title or contract term. Third is the terms and conditions. And fourth is the additional terms. Line A, paragraph 5 and 5B is about the purchase price. You just go ahead and put in the purchase price here in the blank space next to the dollar sign. And if the buyer does not need a loan, if it's a cash offer, then check the box all cash. Line B, close of escrow. This is where you put in either the number of days after acceptance or the specific date on which the escrow is expected to close. Line D talks about initial deposit amount, usually about 3%, but it can be a different amount. The law does not prohibit it to be lower or higher. It's just that you need to understand that if the deposit is greater than 3%, the maximum that the buyers can lose their deposit over is 3% of the purchase price. Also, there's a note that says the percentage number above is for calculation purposes, and it's not a contractual term. So all that simply means is if there's a conflict between the percentage and the dollar amount, it's the dollar amount that is determinative or controlling. And the standard time to wire transfer the initial deposit is 3 business days after acceptance. Under the new RPA, you have to do the deposit by wire transfer only. They don't allow any other types of transfer of deposit, just limited to wire transfer. D2 is talking about increased deposit. There may be times when a buyer is not willing to give all the deposit to the seller initially, simply because the buyer wanted to see how the inspection results turn out to be. If they are satisfied with the inspection result, then they are willing to deposit additional earnest money deposit into escrow. And that's when you use the increased deposit. Same thing, if there's a conflict between the percentage and the dollar amount, then it is the dollar amount that controls. On the right-hand side, you see additional term. There could be any other type. It could be any condition for the deposit of the additional deposit, but the most common one is removal of all contingencies. That's when the buyer will put in the increased deposit. Not very common, but it's there for the buyer to use if the buyer wants to. Line E, loan amount. And first is the first lien. Same thing with the amount and the percentage, and is usually the dollar amount that controls. Second line is the interest rate. The buyer will indicate whether it's a fixed rate or adjustable rate. If it's adjustable rate, you will check the adjustable rate box. It says here initial adjustable rate not to exceed whatever the percentage is. Hello, 等一下。So the buyer can indicate what would be the maximum for the initial adjustable rate. And points, the default is buyer will pay 0 points. But if the loan comes with points, then the buyer can go ahead and indicate the amount for the points. And on the last line, it says here if FHA or VA check deliver list of lender required repairs. Now, on the right-hand side, where the additional term is, the buyer will indicate what kind of loan the buyer is getting. Is it conventional, or is it FHA, VA, seller financing, or other type of financing like private money loan or hard money loan? If the buyer checks FHA or VA, then the buyer's agent will prepare the car form, the FVAC. FVAC stands for FHA VA, a mandatory clause. HID, there will be the home inspection disclosure. Both documents are intended by the government to protect the buyer's interest. Now back to if FHA or VA is checked, the buyer would need to deliver a list of lender required repairs, if any, to the seller within a certain number of days, that is 17 days after acceptance. The purpose of that is to let the buyer know what are the required repairs, and to let the seller know what are the required repairs. If the seller is not agreeable to doing the repairs, which the seller is not obligated to agree to, then the seller may refuse it, in which case the deal would have to be canceled. Because if it is a lender required repairs, the lender is not going to fund the loans unless the seller makes the repairs. For FHA and VA, the loan itself will not allow the buyer to spend their own money to make the repairs. Line E2, additional finance amount. In some situation, the buyer does not have enough financing ability, and the amount of loan that they could qualify for first lien position is not enough to make the purchase. In this case, they probably need to figure out additional finance amount. That could come from some other lender that's willing to loan second lien, or some private money lender. Same thing, if there's a conflict between the percentage and the dollar amount, is the dollar amount that governs. Interest rate and points will be indicated here as well. For the additional finance amount, you don't see the FHA or VA as an option because the government does not loan FHA or VA loan for other than first lien position. Next line is occupancy type. The buyer would have to indicate if it's secondary or investment because it is assumed to be for primary use, primary home, unless it's indicated otherwise. Secondary simply means it's a second home. Investment is a property that the buyer is going to use for return as an investment property. Line F, the balance of down payment. That's self-explanatory, and then the purchase price. On page 2, line G, seller credit, if any, to buyer. If there is a conflict between the percentage and the dollar amount concerning the seller credit, then the dollar amount would control. On the additional term, it is indicated that the seller credit is to be applied to closing costs only. It cannot be applied to anything other than closing costs. That's usually the case for most lenders. Line G for additional finance terms. Line H, verification of all cash, verification of down payment and closing costs, verification of loan application, all due within 3 days after acceptance. On the additional term, it would have to be indicated whether we have pre-qualification, pre-approval, or fully underwritten pre-approval. The type of approval will indicate the strength of the borrower's loan. Certainly, if your borrower's loan has been fully underwritten, it is definitely to the borrower's advantage to check the fully underwritten pre-approval. Line I is intentionally left blank. Line J, final verification of condition. That's like a final walkthrough, and that hasn't changed from the last version of the form. That would take place 5 days prior to close of escrow. Line K, assignment request. That request would have to be made within 17 days after acceptance. So if the buyer wants to assign the purchase contract to someone other than an entity that the buyer controls, then seller's consent is required. If the assignment is to an entity that the buyer controls, then no seller consent is required. Line L, contingencies. There are several types of contingencies on this purchase agreement. The buyer has loan, appraisal, investigation of property, review of seller documents, preliminary title report, common interest disclosures, review of leased or lien items, or sale of buyer's property. On the loan contingency, it is to be removed 17 days after acceptance. However, in some cases, the buyer has no loan contingency. If that is the case, then the box in the last column will be checked. Next, appraisal contingency. And for the appraisal contingency, the buyer would have to indicate an amount for the appraisal contingency. It used to be that there was no dollar amount indicator for appraisal contingency in the previous version of the form. Now there is. The buyer can leave it blank and go with a purchase price, or the buyer can specify a certain dollar amount. I think it gives more flexibility. I'll give you an example. Let's say the purchase price is $970,000. The buyer essentially has extra cash in the bank account, and even if the property does not appraise, the buyer has enough money left in the bank to make up the difference. That's why it's a better form, because you don't have to drop a special term to cover this situation. In the past, before this change occurred, a selling agent would have to add a line, a sentence in the addendum indicating that if the shortfall is less than by a certain amount, then the buyer will make up the difference. In this case, there's no need to add this provision because it's built in line L2 by inserting a purchase price here. On the right hand side, if there's no appraisal contingency, then this box will be checked. But bear in mind that removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in FVIC. So if you have a buyer who's an FHA buyer, because FVIC is a required addendum or clause, even if the buyer went ahead and removed the appraisal contingency, the buyer still maintains the right to cancel the purchase contract if the property doesn't appraise for whatever reason. Next line is the investigation or inspection contingency. Next is informational access to property. That has nothing to do with inspection. Rather, it's a right that the buyer has to go onto the property and gather information regarding the property unrelated to the condition of the property, or it could be related, whatever the case may be, but it's not a contingency, and it does not create any kind of cancellation rights. However, it's a right that the buyer has, even if all contingencies have been removed. Review of seller documents. This has to do with certain documents that the seller voluntarily provide to the buyer, upon which the buyer can exercise their right to cancel if they are not satisfied with the information in the documents. Next line, L5, preliminary title report. The buyer will receive a preliminary title report, usually from the escrow, who would normally order it from the title insurance company. The buyer will go ahead and review the prelim and satisfy the buyers themselves as to the conditions of the title of the property. L6, common interest disclosure. That has to do with HOA in condominium project or any property that is part of a homeowners association. L7, review of leased or liened items. The most common lease item is a solar panel. Although it's not always limited to solar panel, it can be other types of lease items. Most of the time it has to do with solar panel because those solar panels have very long leases, and the seller would not be willing to transfer title to the property to the buyer unless the buyer is willing to assume the lease. So at some point during the escrow, the seller would deliver certain documents related to the solar panel lease, and based on the disclosure, the seller would decide if the buyer would decide if the buyer is going to assume the lease or not. Certainly, that's a right that the buyer has. However, if the buyer is not going to assume the lease, 99% the seller is going to have to cancel the purchase agreement. Propane tanks, it's not very common. In some remote area, propane tanks are on a lease, so pay attention to that. And the common liens that have to do with renewable energy or clean energy, the government has certain programs. It's called the PACE program that would help finance that would help the homeowners finance construction of energy saving facilities on the buyer's property and have that finance be done through additional property taxes. So there will be a lien against the property, and that lien will actually be part of the preliminary title report. It will show up on the preliminary title report. So that is something that is excluded from title insurance. So if the buyer is not satisfied or does not want to undertake or assume that those liens, then the buyer certainly will object to it, and the buyer has the right to cancel. That's why it's also a buyer's contingency. So the above contingencies are tied to the last column on removal of waiver of contingency. On the last column where it says additional term, it says any contingency may be removed or waived by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal form and checking the appropriate box. Removal or waiver at the time of offer is against agent's advice. So if the buyer, in their desire to compete better in the bidding war, decides to waive contingencies when they submit their offer, then the contingency removal form is quite commonly used to be attached to the offer. The last one is the sale of buyer's property contingency. in a standard form, that is not a contingency unless the COP form is attached. COP form has to do with the buyer's contingency, sale of buyer's property contingency. Item M, time of possession. The standard provision is upon notice of recordation. It's at 6 p.m. is the default time. Or if the buyer so desires, it can be a different time. Just indicate that on the purchase contract. Or it could be some other date. And if it's a tenant occupied, then the TOPA form, TOPA stands for Tenant Occupied Property Addendum, would have to be attached. Now, at the time of the recording of this video, TOPA has not been released yet, so I can't even begin to discuss TOPA at the moment. I'm sure it has to do with the fact that the tenants will be there or would still be occupying the property, or it could be that there might be an agreement or negotiation between the seller and the buyer for the seller to do the eviction of the tenant, or it could be that the buyer would agree to evict the tenant. I don't know what the content is. We'll have to wait and see. Next on M2, seller occupied or vacant units. So if it's not tenant occupied, however, if it's seller occupied, then the agreement will have to say if the property will be vacated by the seller at close of escrow, or there's going to be a rent back by the seller. If there's a rent back by the seller, there are two types of rent back. One that is 29 days or fewer. Another one is 30 or more days. The reason why there should be a distinction between 29 or less or 30 or more is because in California, if a seller is in possession for 30 or more days, somehow the seller acquires the right of a tenant. As opposed to less than 30 days, then the seller does not acquire the rights of a tenant. On the right-hand side, where it talks about additional terms, the selling agent would either prepare an SIP form if it's 29 or fewer days, or RLAS, which stands for Residential Lease After Sale form, if it's 30 or more days. M3, tenant-occupied units. It says see TOPA form. If tenant-occupied, typically TOPA will be attached. That's the brand new form that they introduced this December. Item N, document fees and compliance. N1, seller delivery of documents. By contract, the seller is required to deliver all documents to the buyer within 7 days after acceptance, unless otherwise specified. So it's a very short deadline. And 2, sign and return escrow holder provisions and restrictions. Once the purchase contract is sent to the escrow holder, upon receipt, the escrow officer would have only 5 days to return the signed escrow holder provision. And 3, time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. This is something new. In the old version, there is no specification in the purchase agreement about when the seller has to pay the HOA to order the HOA docs. So sometimes there could be delay because the seller did not timely pay the HOA. In order for the HOA to process the documents, a fee must be paid to the management company usually. Once the fee is processed, then they begin to work on the HOA docs. and that payment is due 3 days after acceptance. M4. Install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detector, water heater bracing. That is statutory required. That's required by law. In the past, it can be accomplished much later, and because of that, there could be delay due to smoke alarm, carbon monoxide, or water heater bracing not done, because when the appraiser shows up, the appraiser wants everything to be done, everything to be installed. If there's even one single thing missing amongst the 3 items that I just described, then they have to come back for another inspection, and that costs money. That's why it makes sense to put a deadline on this, and this deadline is 7 days after acceptance of the purchase contract. And 5, evidence of representative authority. And that's only 3 days after acceptance. What's evidence of representative authority? That means that if one side or the other, buyer or seller or both, are legal entities, then whoever that's acting for the legal entity is obviously acting in a representative capacity. And either side has the right to demand to see if the person signing the documents, in fact, had the legal authority to sign the documents. And this is what we call evidence of representative authority.